One of the issues is, for us always is how payers deal with this. We talked about share of cost and how you decide, what payers think about IV versus oral therapy in terms of invasive delivery, and what the concerns are about the different treatments. Paclitaxel is now generic, but it's IV. This drug will be new and not generic and oral. So, John, can you tell us a little bit about what your perspective is on this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, is it two drugs? You described the pill taking, but is it two drugs?
So it's two drugs combined. I mean, the product Araxil includes oral paclitaxel, which is poorly absorbed because of the P-glycoprotein. And
so it's in one pill.
No, actually, it's a bunch of pills. There is like a little blister pack with one pill that's in Sequidor, and then another blister pack with a whole bunch of gel tablets that have oral paclitaxel in them.
Okay. So for the patient, another consideration, as you alluded to, is going to be the patient cost. IV paclitaxel, as you know, is generic, and even if patients don't have cost coverage with a Medigap policy, they're going to be paying a small amount of dollars. But for an oral therapy, if they have a Medicare Advantage plan or if they have traditional Medicare, they're going to be paying 25% coinsurance up until they hit their catastrophic coverage, and then they got 5% after that. So I think the cost of this, depending on what it is, it may be prohibitive to some patients. And even if patients have Part D coverage, they're still going to have significant costs. I think for us as a plan, what we observe all the time is simply that if there is only an oral therapy, everybody thinks that the new IV is the cat's meow because we can ensure compliance. And if there is only an IV therapy, everybody thinks that the new oral therapy is the cat's meow because it will improve patient convenience. And I think there's a mixture of both. I think I agree with Claudine that it's nice to have an option. It will be, and I think that fundamentally, though, Medicare is going to require that we cover this drug if it's FDA approved, and we'll have to allow that oral therapy. So I think that the rate limiting factor may be patient preference. In one exception, I don't know how many of your practices or how many of your institutions are involved in OCM, the oncology care model through CMMI. As someone noted, I can't remember who now, that most of these patients who are on IV therapy can be coached through the toxicities. And if you're in an OCM practice and now these dollars are coming out of your pocket instead of the federal government's, it may be in the institution's interest to try and coach those patients through the IV therapy. There are a lot of private practices that are in OCM, and I'm confident that if they've got a generic paclitaxel IV compared to a drug that might cost $10,000 a month, they're going to work very hard to try and get that patient to tolerate the IV paclitaxel.
So you see a situation where the payers might, and outside of Medicare, might say, we would approve IV paclitaxel, but unless there's a demonstrated superiority, we don't want to pay for this expensive drug. What about the difference in neuropathy? What kinds of differences would influence a payer to pay for the more expensive drug?
I suspect that if patients developed neurotoxicity on the IV paclitaxel, that would be an indication for covering them. I just want to clarify, as I read the abstract, it looked like in the modified intention to treat analysis that the overall survival was 27.9 months versus 16.9 months. Do you think that may be inaccurate because of the study design?
No, I don't think overall survival is one of those hard endpoints. So it's pretty good, in general. It's they have a modified intent to treat population, which are patients who took at least a certain amount of drug, which is unusual for intent to treat in general, but was based on the fact of where they did the study and the fact that it was also oral. So, I think that I think that is an impressive difference. And of course, survival differences that's what you're referring to, might motivate a payer to pay the more expensive drug.
Yeah. And with that said, in practices that are in OCM where the dollars are coming out of their pockets, what would they do in that circumstance? I think everyone that I know of in 5 or 6 practices in OCM would err on the side of giving the drug that produced the longest survival. But this study is also interesting because it highlights the importance of doing phase 3 trials. If we were just to have done a phase 2 trial or just looked at progression-free survival as an endpoint, the difference was about a month difference between the two, and we would have made a beta type error and concluded there was no difference when in fact there really was. So I think one of our frustrations as a payer, especially with the CARES Act and especially with or the 21st Century Cures Act, there we go, and the FDA's approval of a lot of drugs based on phase 2 data alone, and oftentimes single-arm phase 2 trial data. Our frustration is that we don't really know at the end of the day whether or not there's a patient-meaningful endpoint that's been achieved. I think this study showed that it was important to look at overall survival because the difference in PFS was very modest.
Yeah, I think the neuropathy might also be a way that providers will be able to go back to the payer and say, I know you want us to use paclitaxel, but this patient already has underlying neuropathy. So it'll be interesting because I think that may be very motivating data with the overall survival still relatively early for this trial. Claudine, I know that there's been a question, and Tiffany brought this up a little bit earlier too, that the control arm wasn't our standard control arm for this trial with every 3-week paclitaxel. How much does that impact your, assessment of overall survival versus the neuropathy or other endpoints?
I mean, I think it makes us a little bit less enthusiastic to jump on that huge overall survival benefit. CLGB quite a while ago did a randomized trial looking at weekly versus Q3-week paclitaxel and showed that the weekly was superior. I don't remember the differences off the top of my head, but they weren't as marked as the differences in overall survival that we're seeing in this trial. But I think it makes us a little less likely to scream off the rooftops that this is associated with this huge overall survival difference, but it makes you think that it's unlikely to be inferior for sure, and might be a bit superior. And there may be a lot of reasons associated with that in terms of how compliant people were, what was going on, what was their access to therapy after. So I think we need to integrate all of those things when you're thinking about survival benefit. And I do think we need to be a little cautious not to say that to remember that this is not compared to what we would think of as the standard paclitaxel to use in this setting.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I think what's interesting is that in some settings, weekly paclitaxel and around the world is really not feasible to give. So it's going to be interesting to see, what happens with the further analyses of this data and what people think about it. The issue is more expensive, less expensive will also play a role as well in the rest of the world. There are other oral taxanes that are being studied. Tezataxel, which is another type of oral taxane, is being given in combination with capecitabine versus capecitabine alone in the initial trial, which was patients who'd received taxanes in the adjuvant setting, but not in the metastatic setting, of course. And then in another trial, which is going on now in patients who are taxane naive. So that will be very interesting. That's an oral agent that's given every 3 weeks. And then there's another oral taxane called liporaxil, which is an emulsion from Korea that's being tested in a phase 2 trial compared to weekly paclitaxel in the US now. Priyanka, what are your perspectives on some of these newer studies looking at oral taxanes?
So all of these formulations are different in terms of how they're being delivered, some pills, some emulsions. And we do have experience with liporaxil, which is an emulsion given once a week. It's kind of a liquid that the patient drinks twice a day. And for the most part, it's relatively well tolerated. The main issues have been with diarrhea and bad taste in mouth. But it doesn't require the extensive timing of fasting and number of pills. So from that aspect, that makes it easier, and you only take it once a week, so there's not multiple doses spread over multiple days. And this drug's approved in Korea for gastric cancer. So I think we will see more of these agents and formulations, and probably the one with the best efficacy and the one that's easiest to deliver in clinic might be the winner.
Yeah, and it's interesting because tezactaxil is being tested in combination with capecitabine, so that's a little bit different. It's a little bit hard to separate out the toxicities of that combination therapy. But that first trial, contested trial, has completed accrual, so we hope to see results in the next year or so. Who knows? But it's interesting. I think we're really entering a new era where we're, I think our whatever it is, our sort of threshold for thinking that a new drug is good has increased as we've had a lot of targeted agents. But I think having oral therapy for us in the US would be a tremendous advance. We never got the oral vinorelbine approved. So, it would be nice that to see some additional options for our patients. Thanks very much for everybody's participation. This was a great discussion.